The howling wind cut like a knife through the threadbare fabric of Hannah Nichols' dress as she stumbled through the mounting snowdrifts, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air of the Arizona mountains. Behind her lay the town of Springerville, and with it, the man who had promised to love her but had only delivered pain. It was January 1876, and the unexpected blizzard that had descended upon Apache County was unforgiving to those caught unprepared. Hannah had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's silver locket clasped around her neck. Her fingers had long since lost feeling, her lips turned blue, and still she pressed forward, knowing that to return meant certain death. 3 days earlier, Thomas Garrett had struck her for the final time. Hannah had endured 2 years of marriage to the respected merchant, maintaining a facade of contentment while suffering behind closed doors. His rage, fueled by whiskey and jealousy, had escalated until that fateful night when she'd seen murder in his eyes. She'd waited until he passed out, then slipped away, intending to reach the next town over before he realized she was gone. But nature had other plans. The storm had swept in without warning, trapping her in a white prison between settlements. "Just a little farther," Hannah whispered through cracked lips, though she had no destination in mind. Her legs buckled beneath her as she trudged up the gentle slope of a hill. Beyond it lay nothing but more wilderness, more snow, more emptiness. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. Hannah knew what darkness meant in these temperatures. She would not survive the night. As consciousness began to slip away, she sank to her knees, then collapsed onto her side. The snow felt almost warm against her cheek now, a dangerous comfort. Her eyelids grew heavy, frost clinging to her lashes. In that moment between awareness and oblivion, Hannah thought she heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, but surely it was just her mind playing tricks, offering false hope before the end. As her eyes closed, a dark figure on horseback crested the hill, silhouetted against the dusky sky. Blake Novak had been tracking a wounded wolf for the better part of the day. The rancher had lost 2 calves to the predator last week and couldn't afford to lose more. The sudden snowstorm had nearly forced him to abandon the hunt and return to his cabin, but something kept him pressing forward through the worsening conditions. When he spotted the small form half buried in the snow, he initially mistook it for the wolf, perhaps having succumbed to its injuries. It wasn't until he dismounted and approached that he realized it was a woman. Her skin was pale as the snow itself, lips tinged with blue and eyelashes frosted white. Kneeling beside her, he pressed his fingers to her neck, surprised to find a faint, thready pulse still fighting against the cold. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" Blake called, gently turning her over. Her face was badly bruised and not from the fall. The purple and yellow marks around her eye and cheekbone told a story he'd seen before. Hannah's eyelids fluttered briefly. Through the haze of cold and exhaustion, she made out the silhouette of a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Fear surged through her had Thomas found her already, but she lacked the strength even to flinch away. Blake saw the fear in her eyes and recognized it instantly. "You're free now," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I won't hurt you, I promise." As consciousness slipped away again, Hannah heard those words echo in her mind, "You're free now." She wanted desperately to believe them. Blake worked quickly, removing his heavy coat and wrapping it around Hannah's frozen form. He lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her and cradling her against his chest to share what warmth he could. His cabin was 3 miles to the east, and he prayed she would survive the journey. The blizzard intensified as Blake urged his horse through deepening snow. The animal struggled forward, trusting its master's guidance despite the worsening conditions. Blake kept one arm firmly around Hannah's waist, her head lolling against his shoulder. He could feel each shallow breath she took, and with every passing minute he feared they would be her last. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just a little longer." After what seemed an eternity, the outline of Blake's small ranch came into view. It wasn't much a modest cabin, a barn and a corral, but in that moment, it was salvation. Blake guided his horse directly to the cabin door, dismounting carefully while supporting Hannah's limp form. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The cabin's interior was simple but warm, with a fire already burning low in the hearth. Blake laid Hannah on his bed, then hurried to stoke the flames. Once the fire was blazing, he turned his attention back to the woman. Her clothes were soaked through with snow, her skin ice-cold to the touch. She needed to be warmed, and quickly. Blake hesitated, aware of the delicacy of the situation. He had no wife, no female neighbor to call upon. He would have to tend to her himself with as much propriety as the dire circumstances allowed. "Forgive me, madam," he murmured, beginning the necessary task of removing her wet garments. He worked efficiently, averting his eyes as much as possible while replacing her clothing with one of his own flannel shirts and a pair of wool socks. He covered her with every blanket he possessed, then set a pot of water to boil. Once it was heated, he filled a hot water bottle and tucked it beneath the blankets near her feet. There was nothing more to do now but wait. Blake settled into a chair beside the bed, studying the woman's face in the firelight. Despite the bruising, he could see she was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with delicate features and chestnut hair now drying in loose waves around her shoulders. The marks on her face told their own story. Whoever had done this to her had been striking her for some time. Blake's jaw tightened. He had seen such things before, had even intervened once in town when a drunken miner was beating his wife in the street. The woman had thanked Blake, then returned to her husband the next day. It was not his place to judge, but he could not fathom how any man could raise his hand to a woman. As the hours passed, Blake maintained his vigil. Occasionally, Hannah would stir, murmuring incoherently before slipping back into unconsciousness. He bathed her bruised face with warm water, coaxed sips of broth between her lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. By dawn, her breathing had become stronger, more regular, though she had yet to fully awaken. The blizzard continued to rage outside, sealing them into this small sanctuary together. Blake knew he needed to tend to his livestock, regardless of the weather. Reluctantly, he donned his coat and gloves, cast a final glance at the sleeping woman, and ventured into the storm. Hannah awoke to unfamiliar surroundings, panic rising in her throat before memory returned. The cold, the snow, collapsing, and then a man, a stranger. "You're free now," he had said. But was she? She tried to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in her joints. The cabin was small but tidy, clearly a bachelor's dwelling. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across rough-hewn furniture. Outside, the wind still howled, carrying with it the occasional thump of ice against the window. Hannah took stock of her situation. She was wearing clothes that were not her own, a man's flannel shirt that reached nearly to her knees. Her own garments were hanging near the fire, nearly dry now. The realization that someone had undressed her sent a flush of embarrassment through her, but she detected no evidence of impropriety. Whoever had rescued her had done so with honorable intentions, it seemed. The door opened suddenly, bringing with it a blast of cold air and a flurry of snowflakes. Hannah pulled the blankets up to her chin as a tall man stomped the snow from his boots and closed the door behind him. He turned, freezing when he saw she was awake. "You're up," he said, his voice deep but gentle. He remained by the door as if not wanting to frighten her by coming closer. "How are you feeling?" Hannah studied him cautiously. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders and strong, work-roughened hands. His face was weathered from the sun, but handsome, with clear blue eyes that regarded her with concern. "Better," she managed, her voice raspy. "Thank you for saving me," he nodded, stepping forward slowly to hang his coat on a peg by the door. "Blake Novak," he introduced himself. "And you are," Hannah hesitated, if she gave her real name and if Thomas came looking for her. "Helen," she lied. "Helen Nelson." Blake seemed to accept this without question. Well, Miss Nelson, you're welcome to stay until the storm passes and you're well enough to travel. I reckon that'll be a few days at least. Hannah nodded gratefully, though inside she felt a twinge of panic. She had no plan, no destination, no money to speak of. Once she was well, where would she go? Are you hungry? Blake asked, moving to the small stove in the corner. I've got some stew left from yesterday. Yes, please, Hannah replied, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Blake ladled stew into a bowl and brought it to her, along with a spoon and a cup of water. He set them on a small table beside the bed, then retreated to give her space. Thank you, Hannah said, taking the bowl with trembling hands. The rich aroma made her mouth water and she ate slowly, savoring each bite. May I ask what you were doing out in that storm? Blake inquired after a moment, his tone conversational rather than demanding. Hannah swallowed hard, staring into her stew. I was traveling. The storm caught me by surprise. Blake nodded, but his eyes told her he suspected there was more to the story. He glanced at the fading bruises on her face but didn't press further. Well, you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here. There was such conviction in his voice that Hannah found herself wanting to believe him. But she had believed Thomas once too, when he had promised to cherish and protect her. I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Novak, but I won't impose on you for long. As soon as the weather clears, there's no rush, Blake interrupted gently. And it's just Blake, no need for formalities when we're sharing a cabin. Hannah managed a small smile, the first in what felt like ages. Blake then. For 3 days, the blizzard kept them confined to the cabin. Blake insisted on sleeping in a bedroll near the fire, giving Hannah the bed. He was unfailingly respectful, always announcing his presence before entering from outside, maintaining a polite distance between them. He asked few questions about her past, and Hannah offered little information, though the silence between them grew increasingly comfortable. On the morning of the 4th day, Hannah awoke to sunlight streaming through the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine white landscape that glittered beneath a clear blue sky. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, which Blake had carefully laundered and dried, then made her way outside. The cold air was bracing but no longer lethal. Hannah stood on the porch, breathing deeply, feeling a sense of possibility she hadn't experienced in years. She was alive. She was away from Thomas. Perhaps, just perhaps, she really was free. Blake emerged from the barn, leading a dappled gray mare. He smiled when he saw Hannah, raising a hand in greeting. Beautiful morning, he called, approaching the porch. Thought I'd ride into town, see if the road's passable yet. Need anything while I'm there? Hannah's heart sank. Town meant people, and people meant gossip. If Blake mentioned finding a woman in the snow, word might get back to Thomas. Actually, she began hesitantly, I was wondering if I might stay on a bit longer. I could earn my keep. I'm good with a needle and I can cook, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need, Blake interrupted, his expression sincere. No need to earn your keep, but if you're set on it, I wouldn't say no to a hot meal that isn't my own cooking. Relief washed over Hannah. Thank you, she said simply. Blake nodded, seeming to understand all she wasn't saying. I'll be back before sundown. Make yourself at home. As he rode away, Hannah stood watching until he disappeared from view. Then she turned back to the cabin, determined to prove her worth. She spent the day cleaning, organizing, and preparing a hearty beef and potato stew with the supplies Blake had in his larder. By the time she heard hoofbeats approaching late that afternoon, the cabin was spotless. Bread was baking in the oven, and the stew was simmering fragrantly on the stove. Blake stomped the snow from his boots as he entered, then paused, inhaling deeply. Smells like heaven in here, he remarked, setting down a burlap sack. You didn't have to go to all this trouble. It was no trouble, Hannah replied, suddenly shy under his appreciative gaze. It's the least I could do, Blake gestured to the sack. Brought you some things, figured you might need them. Curious, Hannah opened the sack to find a simple but sturdy dress, a warm shawl, and a pair of women's boots. Beneath these were basic toiletries, a hairbrush, soap, and a small jar of cream for her healing bruises. "How did you know my size?" she asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. Blake shrugged, looking a bit embarrassed. "Asked Mrs. Peterson at the general store to guess based on my description." "Hope they fit all right." Hannah blinked back unexpected tears. "They're perfect, thank you." They ate dinner together at Blake's small table, the conversation flowing more easily than before. Blake spoke of his small ranch, his hopes to expand his herd come spring, the challenges of making a living in this wild country. Hannah listened, offering occasional comments but still guarding her own story closely. "Town's buzzing with news," Blake mentioned casually as they finished their meal. "Seems Thomas Garrett's wife has gone missing. He's offering a reward for information." Hannah froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully, trying to control her trembling hands. "Is that so?" she managed, her voice barely audible. Blake nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Word is she ran off 4 days ago, right before the blizzard hit." He paused, then added quietly, "He's telling folks she stole money from him, says she's not right in the head." Anger flashed through Hannah. "That's a lie," she snapped, then immediately clasped her hand over her mouth, realizing her mistake. Blake's expression softened. "I figured as much," he said gently. "Your name isn't Helen, is it?" Hannah shook her head slowly. "Hannah," she whispered. "Hannah Garrett. Though I wish I'd never taken his name." "Hannah," Blake repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "It suits you better than Helen." He leaned forward slightly. "I didn't tell anyone about you, not a soul. As far as Springerville is concerned, I've been snowed in alone these past days." Relief and gratitude washed over Hannah. "Why would you protect me? You don't even know me." Blake's gaze drifted to the fading bruises on her face. "I know enough," he said simply. "No woman runs into a blizzard without good reason." "He'll come looking for me," Hannah said, voicing her deepest fear. "Not because he loves me, but because he thinks he owns me." "Let him come," Blake replied, a steely edge to his voice. "This is my land. You're under my protection now if you want to be." The offer hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to fully examine. Hannah nodded slowly, accepting his protection without committing to anything more. It was enough for now, this fragile sanctuary, this moment of safety. That night, as Hannah lay in Blake's bed listening to his steady breathing from his place by the fire, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond fear. A life where she might wake each day without dread, might speak without weighing every word, might even laugh freely again. It seemed an impossible dream, yet here she was, already one step closer to it. In the days that followed, Hannah and Blake established a rhythm of coexistence. She took charge of the household tasks while he tended to the livestock and made repairs around the property. They ate their meals together, talking more freely as trust between them grew. Hannah learned that Blake had come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, determined to build something of his own after his parents died of influenza. He had worked cattle drives and mines before saving enough to purchase this small ranch, which he was slowly expanding. In turn, Hannah shared pieces of her own story, how she had met Thomas when he came to her father's funeral, offering comfort and stability to a grieving daughter left with mounting debts. How the charming suitor had transformed into a controlling husband almost immediately after their wedding. How the first blow had come 6 months into their marriage, followed by tearful apologies and promises that were broken again and again. "Why did you stay?" Blake asked one evening as they sat before the fire, Hannah mending one of his shirts while he whittled a piece of pine wood. Hannah sighed, setting down her needle. "At first, I believed him when he said he was sorry. Then when I knew better, I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, no family, no money of my own." She touched her mother's silver locket absently. "And then I stayed because I was afraid he would kill me if I tried to leave." "What changed?" Blake asked softly. 3 nights before you found me, he came home drunk, raving about seeing me smile at the blacksmith when I went to pick up a pot he'd repaired. He said. Hannah swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. He said he'd rather see me dead than shaming him like a common whore. He had his hands around my throat when he passed out. I knew when he woke, he'd finish what he started. Blake's hands had stilled, the half-formed wooden figure forgotten in his white-knuckled grip. "If he ever comes near you again, I'll kill him," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Hannah looked up, startled by the intensity in his usually gentle eyes. "I don't want you becoming a murderer on my account. Some men forfeit their right to live when they choose to prey on those weaker than themselves," Blake replied, though his expression softened when he saw her distress. "But I hope it doesn't come to that. Springerville's a fair distance, and with snow still blocking the high passes, he'd have to take the long way around. We've time yet to figure things out." As February gave way to March, the snow began to recede from the valleys, though it still capped the distant mountains. Hannah ventured farther from the cabin each day, helping Blake with outdoor chores and exploring the surrounding wilderness. Her bruises had faded completely, and with them, some of her fear. She began to sleep through the night without startling awake at every sound, began to laugh without catching herself, began to feel the stirrings of hope for a future that might hold more than mere survival. One crisp morning, Hannah was gathering eggs from the small henhouse when she heard Blake call her name. She emerged, basket in hand, to find him standing beside his horse, a look of concern on his face. "Riders coming," he said tersely. "3 of them from the direction of town." Hannah's heart lurched. "Thomas," Blake shook his head. "Can't tell from this distance, could be just travelers passing through." He didn't sound convinced. "Stay in the cabin, I'll handle this." Hannah hurried inside, setting the egg basket on the table with trembling hands. She moved to the window, peering through the thin curtain as 3 mounted figures approached. One of them, a stocky man with a familiar posture that made her stomach clench, was undeniably Thomas. Blake stood in the yard, one hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. He raised the other in greeting as the riders drew near, his stance relaxed but alert. "Morning, gentlemen," Hannah heard him call. "What brings you out this way?" The riders halted a respectful distance away. Thomas Garrett sat atop his bay gelding, flanked by 2 men Hannah recognized as his store clerks, both armed with rifles. "Novak, isn't it?" Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly through the still morning air. "Don't believe we've had the pleasure." "Blake Novak," Blake confirmed with a nod. "And you'd be?" "Thomas Garrett. I own the general store in Springerville." Thomas glanced around, his gaze sweeping over the cabin. "Been riding for days now, searching for my wife. She's gone missing. Thought she might have passed this way." Blake tilted his head, his expression neutral. "Sorry to hear that. When did this happen?" "Nearly 3 weeks ago," Thomas replied, shifting in his saddle. "Right before that big snowstorm. She's not well, you understand. Gets confused, takes notions. Worried sick about her, I am." Hannah's hands clenched into fists. Even now, he was spinning his lies, painting her as unstable, ensuring that if she were found, her word would count for nothing against his. "Haven't seen any woman come this way," Blake said evenly. "Though I doubt anyone could have survived that blizzard on foot." Thomas's expression darkened. "She took money from my safe, enough to hire transport maybe." "That's so." Blake's tone was neutral, but Hannah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Well, as I said, no one's passed by here, just me and my stock waiting out the winter." Thomas studied Blake for a long moment, then dismounted. "Mind if we water our horses? Been a long ride." Blake gestured toward the water trough. "Help yourself." Thomas led his horse forward, his men following suit. As they reached the trough, Thomas paused, stooping to examine something on the ground. When he straightened, he was holding a small blue ribbon, one that Hannah recognized with a jolt of fear as having fallen from her hair the day before. "Interesting," Thomas said, turning the ribbon between his fingers. "My wife has ribbons just like this one. Gift from her mother, she always said." Blake's expression remained impassive. "Is that so? Must be a common style. Found that tangled in my fence last week. Figured it blew in from somewhere." Thomas tucked the ribbon into his pocket, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Mind if we look around a bit, since we've come all this way?" Actually, I do mind, Blake replied, his hand still resting near his gun. This is private property, Mr. Garrett. You've watered your horses and I've told you what I know. Time you moved on. The two men faced each other, tension crackling between them. Thomas's companions shifted nervously, hands moving toward their rifles. 3 against 1, Novak, Thomas said softly. Wouldn't be wise to interfere if I wanted to search your property. 4 against 3, came a new voice, and Hannah saw Blake's nearest neighbor, Hank Wilson, ride up with his son beside him. Both carried shotguns across their saddles. Everything all right here, Blake? Blake nodded to the newcomers, not taking his eyes off Thomas. Mr. Garrett and his friends were just leaving. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he knew when he was outmatched. We'll be moving on then, but I'll be back, Novak. My wife belongs with me and I aim to find her. Best of luck in your search, Blake replied coldly. Though if she ran from you, I'd wager she had good reason. Thomas's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing more as he remounted his horse. With a final glare at Blake, he wheeled his gelding around and rode off, his companions following close behind. Once they were out of sight, Blake turned to Hank. Obliged for the assist, the older man nodded. Saw them riding toward your place, thought I'd check things were all right. That Garrett fellow's got a nasty reputation. Wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him. You're not wrong, Blake agreed grimly. Listen, Hank, if you see him around again, I'll send word, Hank promised. You take care now. With a tip of his hat, he and his son rode back toward their own property. Blake waited until they were gone before hurrying to the cabin. Hannah stood in the doorway, pale but composed. He'll be back, she said quietly. Blake nodded. Yes, but not today, and not alone next time either. What are we going to do? Hannah asked, the momentary relief of Thomas's departure already fading before the reality of their situation. Blake ran a hand through his hair, thinking. We've got 2 choices as I see it. We can stay and fight legally, I mean. Go before the judge in Hallbrook, tell him what Garrett did to you, seek a divorce. He'd never grant it, Hannah said, shaking her head. Thomas has money, influence. His word against mine, and he's already spreading stories that I'm unstable. Or, Blake continued, we can leave. Head west to California or north to Colorado, somewhere he won't find you. We, Hannah echoed, surprised. Blake met her gaze steadily. I wouldn't send you off alone, Hannah. Not unless that's what you want. Hannah felt a flutter of something warm and unfamiliar in her chest. You'd leave your ranch, everything you've built here, land and buildings can be replaced, Blake said simply. Some things matter more. The implication of his words hung between them, neither quite ready to name the growing feelings that had taken root during their weeks together. I can't ask you to give up everything for me, Hannah protested weakly. You didn't ask, Blake reminded her. I'm offering. Hannah looked around the small cabin that had become a sanctuary to her, then out the window at the land beyond. She thought of Blake's quiet strength, his unwavering respect, the way he'd never once made her feel indebted for his help. What if there's a third option? She said slowly, an idea taking shape. What if we stayed but made it impossible for Thomas to claim me? Blake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What did you have in mind? Hannah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. If I were married to another man, legally and properly, Thomas would have no claim on me. Not even the best lawyer could argue otherwise. Blake stared at her, comprehension dawning in his eyes. Hannah, are you proposing to me? Despite everything, Hannah felt a smile tug at her lips. I suppose I am, in a manner of speaking. It would be a marriage of convenience, of course, for protection. Blake stepped closer, his expression serious. Is that really what you want, a marriage based on necessity rather than… He trailed off. Rather than love, Hannah finished for him. She looked down, suddenly shy. I'm not sure I even know what real love is supposed to feel like. Thomas said he loved me, but his love was like a cage. This, she gestured around the cabin, these weeks with you have been the first time I've felt safe, respected, valued. That's how it should be, Blake said softly. Always. Perhaps. Hannah ventured, perhaps that's a better foundation than romantic notions that fade at the first test. Blake considered her words, then nodded slowly. There's wisdom in that, but Hannah, if we do this, I want you to be sure. I won't hold you to it forever if you decide later that you want something or someone else. But while you're my wife, even in name only, I treat you as such, with honor and respect." "I know you would," Hannah replied, and she realized with surprising certainty that she did know it, deep in her bones. This man, whom she had known for such a short time, had proven his character through actions rather than words. Blake took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Then yes, Hannah Nichols, I accept your proposal." Hannah blinked, startled. "How did you know my maiden name?" A smile tugged at the corner of Blake's mouth. "You talk in your sleep sometimes. You called yourself Hannah Nichols the second night you were here." Hannah felt a blush creep up her neck. "Oh, so," Blake continued, still holding her hands, "when shall this wedding take place?" "As soon as possible," Hannah replied, thinking of Thomas's parting threat. "Before he comes back." The following morning dawned clear and mild, a hint of spring in the air despite patches of snow still clinging to the shadowed places. Blake had ridden to the nearest neighbor's farm at first light, returning with news that Judge Parker would be passing through the area that very afternoon on his circuit route. "He's stopping at the Wilson place around 3 o'clock, Blake explained as he unsaddled his horse. "Hank says the judge can perform the ceremony right there if we're agreeable." Hannah nodded, trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. "That's perfect." Blake studied her face, concern in his eyes. "Are you having second thoughts? It's not too late to change your mind." "No," Hannah said firmly. "No second thoughts, just nerves, I suppose. I never imagined my wedding day would be quite like this." Blake's expression softened. "We could wait, do things properly with a church ceremony when—" "No," Hannah interrupted. "Today is perfect. Simple and honest, just as it should be." Blake smiled, and Hannah felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. In the weeks they had spent together, she had come to admire everything about this man: his quiet strength, his gentle humor, his unwavering integrity. What had begun as gratitude had slowly transformed into something deeper, something she was still afraid to name. They spent the morning preparing. Blake cleaned and pressed his best shirt, while Hannah took out the dress he had bought her, sponging away a small stain and pressing it with a heated iron. It was a simple garment, navy blue with small white flowers embroidered at the collar, but it was clean and well-made and wholly untainted by memories of Thomas. Shortly after midday, they set out for the Wilson farm. Blake had hitched his horse to a small wagon, making the journey more comfortable for Hannah. As they rode, Hannah twisted her mother's silver locket between her fingers, a nervous habit from childhood. "Beautiful piece," Blake commented, noticing her preoccupation. "It was my mother's," Hannah explained. "The only thing of value Thomas never tried to take from me. I think he forgot it existed most of the time." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Something old, then." "Pardon for the wedding," Blake clarified. "Isn't that what they say? Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue." Hannah smiled, touched that he knew of the tradition. "Yes, though I'm afraid I have nothing for the rest." "Well, the dress is new," Blake pointed out. "And—" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, offering it to her. "This could be your something blue." Hannah opened her palm to find a small blue jay's feather, its color vivid against her skin. "It's beautiful." "Found it this morning while feeding the horses," Blake said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Thought it might be a good sign. Blue jays are survivors, tough as they come." Hannah carefully tucked the feather into her hair, securing it with a pin. "Thank you." "Still need something borrowed," Blake mused. "I think we can help with that," said Mrs. Wilson when they arrived at the farm. The kindly woman had taken one look at Hannah and immediately insisted on helping her prepare for the ceremony. Now she removed a delicate lace handkerchief from her apron pocket. "My mother carried this at her wedding and I at mine. Would bring me joy to see it used again today." Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes as she accepted the handkerchief. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I'll take good care of it." "You call me Abigail, dear. We're neighbors now." The older woman patted Hannah's hand. And don't you worry about a thing. Judge Parker's a fair man. Once you're married proper to Blake, that first husband of yours won't have a leg to stand on." Hannah blinked in surprise. "You know." Abigail nodded. "Hank told me what happened yesterday. Nasty business, that Garrett fellow coming around making threats. But that's all over now. You're starting fresh today." The simple kindness of these people, virtual strangers who had taken her side without question, nearly overwhelmed Hannah. She had lived so long in fear, in isolation, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be part of a community that protected its own. Judge Parker arrived promptly at 3 o'clock. A tall, imposing figure with a silver beard and keen eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Hank Wilson made the introductions, explaining the situation in broad terms without delving into the specifics of Hannah's history with Thomas. The judge listened carefully, then turned to Hannah. "Young woman, are you entering into this marriage of your own free will without coercion or reservation?" "I am, Your Honor," Hannah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Judge Parker nodded, seemingly satisfied. "And you understand that by marrying Mr. Novak, you are making a legal declaration that any previous marriage is null and void?" "I do understand, Your Honor." The judge turned to Blake. "And you, Mr. Novak, do you enter into this marriage freely and with full knowledge of the circumstances?" "I do, Your Honor," Blake replied firmly. "Very well," Judge Parker said, opening a small book he carried. "Let us proceed." The ceremony was brief but dignified, conducted in the Wilsons' parlor with Hank and Abigail serving as witnesses. Hannah spoke her vows clearly, surprising herself with the depth of emotion she felt as she promised to honor and cherish Blake. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Blake leaned down to place a gentle, chaste kiss on her lips there first. The simple gesture sent an unexpected thrill through Hannah, a spark of something that felt remarkably like happiness. Judge Parker completed the necessary paperwork, providing them with a marriage certificate that he assured them would be recorded officially in Holbrook the following week. "This is a legally binding union," he told them. "Should anyone question it, they can take it up with the territorial court." After sharing a celebratory meal with the Wilsons, Blake and Hannah began the journey back to what was now their home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land, and a gentle breeze carried the promise of warmer days ahead. Neither spoke much during the ride, each lost in their own thoughts about the significance of what they had done. As the cabin came into view, Blake slowed the wagon. "Hannah," he said, her name soft on his lips, "I want you to know something." She turned to look at him, struck anew by the sincerity in his blue eyes. "What is it? This may have started as a marriage of convenience, but that doesn't mean it has to stay that way." He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "I won't rush you and I'll never press for more than you're willing to give, but I want you to know that I already care for you deeply. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, that won't change." Hannah felt tears well in her eyes, but for once they weren't born of fear or sorrow. "Blake," she whispered, squeezing his hand, "I feel the same." Something shifted between them in that moment. A subtle but profound change that acknowledged what both had been feeling, that this union, born of necessity, had the potential to become something far more meaningful. When they reached the cabin, Blake surprised her by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Hannah laughed, the sound bright and unfamiliar to her own ears. "Is that really necessary?" "Absolutely," Blake replied with a grin. "It's tradition." Inside, everything looked just as they had left it, yet somehow different. This was no longer Blake's cabin where Hannah was staying temporarily. It was their home, a shared space that belonged to both of them. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Hannah felt a flicker of nervousness. Blake seemed to sense her unease and immediately moved to put her at ease. "I'll sleep by the fire tonight as usual," he said, gathering his bedroll. "Nothing has to change until you're ready, Hannah. I meant what I said." Hannah looked at the man who was now her husband, this good, patient man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, Blake smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. "Good night, Mrs. Novak, Mrs. Novak." The name settled around Hannah like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it a sense of security she had never known with Thomas. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Hannah realized that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Spring arrived in earnest over the following weeks, transforming the landscape from white to vibrant green. Hannah and Blake fell into a comfortable routine, working side by side to tend the small ranch. Blake taught Hannah to ride, starting with his gentle mare, Daisy. Soon, Hannah was accompanying him on his daily rounds, learning about cattle and the land with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. Their marriage, which had begun as a legal protection, gradually evolved into a true partnership. They shared meals and conversations, laughter and occasional disagreements that they worked through with mutual respect. At night, Blake continued to sleep by the fire, though Hannah found herself increasingly wondering what it might be like to share the bed with him, to feel his arms around her as she drifted off to sleep. It was a mild evening in late April when everything changed. They had spent the day repairing fences in the north pasture, returning home tired but satisfied with their work. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a companionable silence between them. "I never thought I could be this content," Hannah said suddenly, voicing the thought that had been circling her mind for days. Blake turned to look at her, his expression soft in the fading light. "Nor I," he admitted. "Having you here, it's made this place feel like a real home." Hannah gathered her courage, reaching out to take his hand. "Blake, I've been thinking," he waited patiently, giving her time to find her words. "When we married, you said it could be in name only until I decided if I wanted more." Hannah took a deep breath. "I've decided I do want more." "With you?" Blake's hand tightened around hers. "Are you certain? There's no rush, Hannah. We have all the time in the world." "I'm certain," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I care for you, Blake, more than I thought possible after everything, and I trust you completely." Blake raised his free hand to gently cup her cheek. "I care for you too, Hannah, more than I can say." When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the chaste peck at their wedding. This was a kiss full of promise and longing, tender yet passionate. Hannah responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck as she leaned into him, savoring the feeling of being wanted, cherished, desired. That night, Blake shared her bed for the first time. He was gentle and patient, attentive to her needs and responsive to her cues. In his arms, Hannah discovered that physical intimacy could be a joyful, mutual exchange rather than the dutiful submission Thomas had demanded. With Blake, she felt like an equal partner, her pleasure as important as his own. Afterward, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Blake's arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Hannah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. "I think I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could reconsider. Blake's arms tightened around her. "I know I love you," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Have almost from the beginning, I think." Hannah smiled against his chest, marveling at how her life had transformed in just a few months. From the depths of despair, hiding from a man who had promised to love her but had only brought pain, to this genuine love with a man who showed his devotion through actions rather than empty words. "You're free now," Blake had said when he found her half frozen in the snow. At the time, Hannah had been too close to death to fully comprehend his meaning. Now, safe in his arms, she understood that freedom wasn't just about escaping Thomas, it was about finding the courage to build a new life, to trust again, to love without fear. As spring gave way to summer, Hannah and Blake's happiness only deepened. The ranch prospered under their joint care, with Blake adding 10 new calves to his herd and Hannah starting a small vegetable garden that thrived in the rich soil. They made occasional trips into smaller settlements for supplies, carefully avoiding Springerville and any chance of encountering Thomas. It was during one such trip to a trading post near the New Mexico border that they first heard the news. "Terrible business in Springerville last month," the shopkeeper remarked as he wrapped Hannah's purchases. That merchant Garrett shot dead in his own store. Hannah froze, her hand halfway to her purse. Thomas Garrett, she asked, her voice barely audible. The shopkeeper nodded, oblivious to her shock. The very same. Apparently got into a dispute with a customer over an unpaid debt. Man pulled a gun, Garrett reached for his own, and that was that. He shook his head. Left behind a wife, I heard, though no one seems to know where she got to. Ran off before it happened, they say. Blake's hand found the small of Hannah's back, steadying her. That's unfortunate, he said neutrally. Were they able to apprehend the shooter? Oh yes, he'll hang come September. The shopkeeper handed over their packages. Safe travels to you both. Outside, Blake helped Hannah into the wagon, concern evident in his expression. Are you all right? Hannah stared at her hands, trying to make sense of the tumult of emotions washing through her. Relief, guilt, a strange sense of closure all swirled together into a confusing storm. I don't know, she admitted. I never wished him dead despite everything, but I can't deny feeling relieved. Blake covered her hand with his own. That's natural, Hannah. It doesn't make you a bad person. It feels strange, she continued, knowing he's gone. Like the last shadow hanging over us has finally lifted. Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. It means you're truly free now, no looking over your shoulder, no fear of him finding you. Hannah considered this, then looked up at her husband, seeing the love and concern in his face. I was already free, she said softly. The moment you found me in the snow, everything since then has just been learning to believe it. Blake squeezed her hand, then urged the horses forward. They traveled in comfortable silence for a while, each processing the news in their own way. As the miles passed beneath the wagon wheels, Hannah felt a subtle weight lifting from her shoulders, a lingering tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. By the time they reached their ranch, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink. Blake helped Hannah down from the wagon, but instead of heading inside with their purchases, he led her to a small rise overlooking their property. What do you see? He asked, wrapping an arm around her waist. Hannah surveyed the scene before her, the neat cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the sturdy barn and corral where cattle grazed peacefully, the garden she had planted now lush with summer crops. Home, she replied simply. Our home. Blake turned her to face him, his expression serious yet tender. Hannah, when I found you that day, half frozen in the snow, I had no idea how completely you would change my life. I meant what I said then. You're free. You've always been free to choose your path. I'm just grateful that path included me. Hannah reached up to touch his face, tracing the contours she had come to know so well. Best decision I ever made, she said with a smile. Blake captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. I have something for you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band, similar to the one he had placed on her finger during their hasty wedding, but newer, shinier. Blake, Hannah questioned, puzzled. I want to renew our vows, he explained. Not because our first wedding wasn't real, but because circumstances have changed. This time, there's no cloud hanging over us, no practical necessity driving our decision, just love, pure and simple. Tears welled in Hannah's eyes as Blake dropped to one knee before her. Hannah Novak, will you marry me again? Not out of need or protection, but because I love you more than life itself and want to spend every day showing you just how much. Yes, Hannah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. 1,000 times yes. They renewed their vows the following Sunday, in a small church with a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Hannah wore a new dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair and her mother's locket around her neck. Blake, handsome in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. This time, when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was neither hesitant nor restrained, but a joyful affirmation of the love they had found in each other. The celebration continued at their ranch, where neighbors had helped prepare a feast under a canopy of trees. There was music and dancing, laughter and good wishes from the community that had embraced them. As the sun began to set, Blake led Hannah away from the festivities to the privacy of a small grove near the creek. There, he presented her with his final wedding gift, the deed to their ranch, rewritten to include her name alongside his. "This is as much yours as it is mine," he told her. "Everything I have, everything I am, is yours to share." Hannah studied the document, running her fingers over their names, joined together on paper just as they were in life. "Partners in everything," she said, looking up at him with shining eyes. "Always," Blake promised, gathering her into his arms. 1 year to the day after Blake had found Hannah in the snow, their first child was born, a son they named James, after Blake's father. As Hannah held their newborn, Blake sitting beside her on the bed with his arm around her shoulders, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed. "Did you ever imagine, when you set out tracking that wolf, that you'd end up with a wife and son instead?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Blake pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not in my wildest dreams, but I thank God every day that I found you. You saved my life," Hannah murmured, watching as their son's tiny hand wrapped around Blake's finger. "And you saved mine," Blake replied. "I just didn't know I needed saving until you came along." As little James grew, so did the Novak ranch. With careful management and hard work, Blake and Hannah expanded their herd and their holdings. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, though they kept the original cabin standing as a reminder of where their journey together had begun. Their second child, a daughter named Abigail after their kind neighbor Mrs. Wilson, arrived 2 years after James. She had her mother's chestnut hair and her father's blue eyes, and from an early age showed a spirited independence that both delighted and occasionally exasperated her parents. By the time their third child, another son they named William, joined the family, the Novak ranch was one of the most prosperous in the region. Blake had become known not only for his fine cattle, but also for his fair dealings and willingness to help neighbors in need. Hannah, meanwhile, had established herself as a skilled horsewoman and capable partner in all aspects of ranch management, earning the respect of even the most traditional ranchers in the area. On cold winter evenings, when the children were tucked into bed, and the house was quiet save for the crackling of the fire, Blake and Hannah would often sit together, her head resting on his shoulder as they talked about their day or simply enjoyed each other's company. "Do you ever think about that day?" Blake asked once, as a blizzard not unlike the one that had brought them together raged outside. "The day I found you," Hannah nodded, her fingers intertwined with his. "Often. It was the worst day of my life and also the best, though I didn't know it then." Blake squeezed her hand. "I remember how pale you were, how still. I was terrified I'd found you too late." "But you didn't," Hannah reminded him, lifting her face for his kiss. "You found me just in time and you told me I was free." "And were you?" Blake asked softly. "Did that freedom turn out to be everything you hoped?" Hannah thought of the life they had built together, the ranch that had flourished under their care, the children sleeping peacefully down the hall, the love that had grown from a desperate alliance into something so profound, it sometimes took her breath away. "It turned out to be so much more," she replied, leaning up to kiss him again. "So very much more." Outside, the storm continued its assault, wind howling and snow piling against the windows. But inside, Hannah and Blake Novak were warm, safe, and together, free in all the ways that mattered. Bound only by the love they had chosen and continued to choose, day after day, year after year. And as Blake drew Hannah closer, whispering promises against her hair that he had kept 100 times over, she knew with absolute certainty that the freedom he had offered her that fateful day had been the truest gift, not just release from a painful past, but the chance to build a joyful future on her own terms, with a man who loved her completely for exactly who she was. In the years that followed, the legend of the Novak ranch grew throughout the territory. Their fourth child, a daughter they named Grace, completed their family. The children grew strong and capable under their parents' loving guidance, each developing their own talents and interests, while learning the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion that Blake and Hannah held dear. James, the eldest, showed a natural aptitude for ranching from an early age, riding alongside his father from the time he could sit a horse. Abigail, spirited and intelligent, developed a passion for books and learning, eventually becoming the first teacher in the small school that was established as more families settled in the area. William, quiet and observant, revealed a talent for working with animals that went beyond even his father's skills, able to gentle the most skittish horse or heal the most ailing calf. And little Grace, with her mother's gentle determination, became known for her beautiful garden that provided vegetables and medicinal herbs for neighbors far and wide. Through it all, Blake and Hannah's love remained the foundation of their family and their success. Their partnership, which had begun as a desperate measure for Hannah's protection, had evolved into a deep and abiding connection that was evident to anyone who saw them together in the way Blake's eyes followed Hannah across a room, in the way her hand sought his in moments of both joy and challenge, in the respect and affection that characterized their every interaction. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration that brought together friends and neighbors from across the territory. The original small ranch had grown into a substantial operation, with a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, and grazing land that stretched as far as the eye could see. Under a canopy of stars, with lanterns illuminating the faces of those who had become their extended family over the years, Blake raised a toast to his wife. "To Hannah," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "who taught me that real strength isn't about how much land you own or how many cattle you run, but about having the courage to open your heart, even when you're afraid. Every good thing in my life came from finding you in that snowstorm." Hannah, her chestnut hair now threaded with silver but her eyes as bright as ever, raised her own glass. "And to Blake, who kept his very first promise to me that I was free. Free to choose my own path, free to love without fear, free to become the person I was meant to be." As the celebration continued around them, Blake drew Hannah aside, leading her to the small rise where they had often stood to survey their property over the years. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket to produce a small velvet pouch. Hannah opened it to find a delicate silver chain, and on it, a pendant shaped like a snowflake with tiny diamonds catching the moonlight. "Oh, Blake," she breathed, touching it gently. "To remember how our story began," he explained, fastening it around her neck to rest beside her mother's locket. "In the cold and the snow, when everything seemed hopeless, but turned out to be just the beginning." Hannah looked out over their ranch with its lights glowing warmly against the darkness, the sounds of laughter and music floating up from the celebration below. Then she turned back to her husband, the man who had found her at her lowest moment and had seen not a victim to be pitied, but a woman of strength and worth. "I love you, Blake Novak," she said simply. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have left." "And I love you, Hannah Novak," he replied, drawing her into his arms with the same tender care he had shown that very first day. "Forever free and forever mine." As they stood together under the vast Arizona sky, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that desperate flight into the blizzard, to the life they had built together through years of hard work, shared dreams, and unwavering love. She had indeed found freedom, not just from Thomas's cruelty, but freedom to become her truest self, to love and be loved for exactly who she was. And as Blake's lips met hers in a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their years together, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again, to trust this man, to build a life with him, to love him completely 1,000 times over. For in Blake's arms she had found not just safety, but joy, not just respect, but adoration, not just freedom from fear, but the freedom to love without reservation. And in the end, that was the greatest freedom of all.